Well, some of you asked, I just want you to know that Jackson, our dog, is officially in mourning. It didn't take long. Grandma removed Jack's picture off the front cover of her phone, and Declan has arrived. Poor guy. But I know how it is with grandparents. You know, they drive you nuts with pictures. And I am not going to do that. So just, there's only 40 more slides, so hang in there. Well, we're talking about the resistance in this holy season. We hear that term a lot today in political circles, but we do not tend to apply the term to our own faith circle. But the truth is, we all resist. We all resist. When it comes to Jesus, resistance is common. In fact, it is a bit baffling, yet it's factual that we who profess to believe in Christ often resist without thinking about what we're doing when we are wrestling with God. In fact, Christians often resist the God, the very God that we say we trust. There are times when you and I don't want to do it, when we know we should do it, when God has put his thumb on our back, or he's talking to us about a direction or a relationship or something that we know is not right, and he's speaking to us, and we don't want to pull the trigger. We just resist him a little bit. And so then the other part of it is sometimes we're afraid. What's it going to mean if I do this? What does it mean if I let go of this and I embrace him and I follow him and I do those kinds of things? I mean, I remember back when I was wrestling with the call to ministry. You know, I wanted to do just about anything else but that. You know, I tried to find all of the things that would be beneficial, that would kind of the help and instruction and encouraging kinds of careers. And finally, it just kind of come down to it, you know. And I was on again, off again, and I remember Lois and I were pretty thick at that time, and we were talking marriage, and I didn't know what that was mean. I was studying to be an insurance salesman at that time, you know, and I was just trying to figure out in life what I was going to do. And I remember calling my pastor, and I said, I need to talk to you about something, and I went in, and we talked, and I knew that it was what it was, and I remember calling her, and I said, hey, listen, I have a call to the ministry. And she knew that a call to the ministry for me meant a call to the ministry for her, and she wasn't sure she was in on that. And she prayed that week and everything, and I just remember, I said, because I said, listen, I'm going back to school in January whether you come with me or not. Because I knew that I couldn't put her before God at that time. And she was okay with that. She came along, and boy, am I glad she did. You know, because you know and I know, and every church I've ever pastored knows, because this is what you tell me. You can leave anytime you want, but she has to stay. So I know how it works, and I understand that, because when they say better half, it's true. And but we wrestle with God, and that hesitancy is actually resistance. Now, there is a surefire way of knowing that you are resisting, and that is this. Do you know what it is? Do you know how you know if you're resisting? It's when you barter with God. Bartering, there we go. Bartering with God is a sure sign of resistance. Now, in our youth, it went something like this. Dear Lord, if you'll just make Julie like me, I promise that I will witness to 3 guys at gym class today. All right? Or maybe, oh Lord, my friends are telling me that Joe's going to break up with me, and I'm really into him. So if you could just let him hang on, I promise I'll start memorizing Scripture. Or as an adult, it might be, oh Lord, I need this career. I need this interview to go well. If you will just help me get this, and I promise I'll do that. Or maybe it's a medical issue. Or just anything that we approach God with that says, let's make a deal, written all over it. I've even run into a lot of non-believers who all of a sudden don't know where to go or what to turn to, and they turn to God and they say, oh God, I'll start going to church, or I'll do this, or I'll do that if you will just get me out of this jam, or you'll heal my relative, or whatever. Anytime that you and I say, if you will, then I will, we're bartering. We're bartering. And there are a lot of things that we barter with: prayer and attendance and giving or service. What we are actually doing is we're trying to find a way, trying to find something to get God to do what we want him to do. Now, you've probably met someone who has bartered with God, and it didn't turn out well. In fact, they remained mad at God, and they've been mad at him, and they've been done with him ever since. And let's not trivialize this, because some of the stuff that they've asked God for, or they've bartered with God about, are serious things. Such as, I know of a grandfather who had 2 of his grandchildren diagnosed with a terminal disease. And that was it. He to this day, he cannot deal with how a loving God could allow his grandchildren to have a terminal disease. Has already lost one and will soon lose another. You know what? As a dad and now a grandpa, I understand that a little bit. I'm not going to sit there. I would love for him to be able to embrace God and to see that there's more to this life than that. And those words are easy for us to say when we're not involved in them. But let's be honest. Sometimes we've got to understand the hearts of people a little better than we do. But I can understand that. It causes my heart to ache, because I know that God could bring such comfort to him through these times. Or it may be something else. It could be a child that is just, rejected the family and is living some kind of a lifestyle, and as parents and grandparents, you just grieve over that. Or it could be, it could be a number of things that you just wanted God to do, and you were willing to almost do anything for God if he would act the way you want him to act, or force your will on to someone else. So today's character is famous. He's famous for bartering, trying to make a deal of sorts with God. He tried to make a deal through Jesus, and he didn't get out of it what he'd hoped he would. And the reason I know this is because I know that there are times when I've tried to make a deal with God, that I bartered. And if I know anything about human nature, is when we get to a place where we can't control the outcome or change the circumstances, no matter whether we believe in Jesus or not, we have tried to strike a deal, right? I know you're in church, you got your church face on, your church clothes on, and all that kind of stuff, but let's be honest, we've all done this. Our character day saw 3 sides to every issue. There was the right side, the wrong side, and his side. He was in it for himself. And he's much like the rich young ruler that Jesus met, who wanted Jesus to bless him, wanted Jesus' approval. He wanted that rabbinical blessing to be laid upon him. And you remember the conversation. The young guy comes to him and he says, basically again this conversation, and Jesus asks him, have you kept all the commandments? And he says, yes, and he lists a couple. And then Jesus gets to the heart of the issue, because you see the summation of the law is loving God and loving others. And so this is what Jesus says to him. He says, one thing you must do, sell all you have and give to the poor, and come follow me. That's loving God and loving others. And he couldn't do it. Too great a cost. He was in it for himself. Our character who was in it for himself is famous. His name is Judas Iscariot. Now, as you know, many of you know, I'm a Green Bay Packer fan. And a little side note, a few years ago, if you know much about football, some of us checked out last year, but we're hoping we can check back in this year. But if you're a big football fan, you know that Brett Favre was Green Bay's great quarterback for years and years and years. And then he said he was going to retire. Long story. He ended up going to our arch rival Minnesota Vikings, and there was a T-shirt shop in Green Bay that printed his Viking shirt. It was purple with the 4 on the front and white, and on the back where the name goes, it said Judas. Big seller. Big seller. That feeling of betrayal. This is what we know about Judas. This is how we feel about Judas. For Judas, Jesus was a means to an end. But before we point our condemning finger at Judas alone, the rest of the inner circle of 12 disciples, Jesus was also a means to an end as well. In fact, whenever we barter with Jesus, whenever we barter with God, we're treating Jesus as a means to an end. You see, if Jesus was Messiah, if he was the Son of God, and all the indications were that he was, they had all become his chosen few, his inner circle, and they had access to the very power of God. Now, I want to take you to a statement recorded by the historian writer Luke. Remember, Luke was the only non-Jewish writer. Luke interviewed all of these first-hand accounts when he put his, what we call his gospel account of Jesus' life together, and he wrote the first early history of the church. And he did this by interviewing all these people who had seen Jesus and been with Jesus, and Luke himself had become a believer, and he hung out with the likes of Paul and so forth. And this is what he wrote. As the disciples, after Jesus' resurrection and before he ascends, they had some time together right before this, and they remember what they asked Jesus. Here's what those disciples, that small little band of inner circle that was left, asked Jesus. Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? This is after Jesus' death and resurrection. It's after he washed their feet. It's time and time again that he demonstrated that God's kingdom wasn't exactly what they had anticipated God's kingdom to be, and that the Messiah wasn't exactly who they thought the Messiah would be. In other words, Jesus was a different type of Messiah than they had always been taught, always been trained to believe, always been and had always looked for. Okay? And so here they are. They're going back to their old ways. You see, Judas and the disciples had an Old Testament expectation of the Messiah, and the expectation wasn't wrong. It was just that they had been taught in a certain way, and they understood it in a certain way, and so therefore when it played out in a different way, even though he fulfilled everything, they couldn't grasp onto it. They couldn't grasp onto it. And so in a nutshell, Judas and the gang believed the Messiah would hold three main offices. Number one, the Messiah would hold a priestly office. He would be that go-between between God and the people forever. He would be the highest of all high priests, okay? The second thing is that he would be king, and that he would rule justly and fairly over the people, unlike the rulers of their day. And then lastly, he'd be a warrior. And he would be a military figure who would conquer the enemies, such as Rome, and establish Israel's power and territory and pride again. Now, there were those who understood that there might be three Messiahs, one a priest, one a king, and one a warrior. But most held to this idea that these three offices would be found in just one person. One person. Now, here were the issues that Judas had a rub with Jesus over because of these three things. First, Jesus didn't hate the Romans. In fact, he when he was asked, should we pay taxes to the Romans? He said, yeah, pay your taxes. I don't like that passage, but it's there, okay? And so pay your taxes, all right? The other thing was, it was amazing. If you read the gospel, what you find out is that there was a Roman official, a military official, that expressed faith. And Jesus looks at him, and he looks at all the Jews around him in his inner circle and says, I haven't seen faith like this in all of Israel. So here's this Roman guy doing this. Jesus didn't hate the Romans, and it had to be very disappointing when you are expecting a military leader to lead his people against their enemy, and you find out that that your leader doesn't hate the enemy. Secondly, Jesus was always at odds with the religious leaders. Now, if you're going to become the high priest, it's probably a good idea that you get the rest of the priests and the whole temple thing on your side. And Jesus was constantly butting heads because they were into religions, and they were missing the forest for a few trees. And Jesus was always at odds with them on this thing. And he didn't make a move to take over the temple. He was confrontational with the leadership. And then at times, when they thought he should move, he was passive. And then the last thing is, Jesus didn't build up a political war chest of money. You know, they say that money is the mother's milk of politicians. And every time the funds began to build up, and especially Judas, who was the treasurer of the group, they began to build up, Jesus would go and disperse the funds. And it's hard to be king without wealth. So Judas was frustrated by all this. Miracles or no miracles, Jesus wasn't rising to the level that he should have in terms of expectations. And because of that, Judas felt like he was being shortchanged. Now this brings us to the event that pushed Judas over the edge. Jesus and his disciples are found in Bethany, just outside of Jerusalem. And roughly, Bethany is about 5 miles from the capital. And they're there at a guy by the name of Simon the leper's home. We really don't know who Simon the leper is, but they knew then, obviously, because they identified the man as Simon the leper. So everybody kind of knows as they're reading this in the day. So here's what it says. While Jesus was in Bethany in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which she poured on his head as he was reclining at the table. And then it goes on, it says, when the disciples saw this, they were indignant. Why this waste? They asked. The perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor. So let's set the setting. In Jesus' day, you would have these jars, and they didn't have twist tops like this, where you could unseal it and then reseal it. So I don't know what it looked like. It may have looked a little bit like a soda bottle or whatever. But anyway, she breaks it. And once you break it, you either use it or put it in something smaller. She breaks it, and she pours it all over Jesus' head. And when she pours it, it runs down over his hair and down in his back. And the perfume is just overpowering in the whole area. It probably went out into the streets. And as the guys are looking at this, they're just losing their mind. You see, because John says this about it. He says that this perfume probably was an entire year's worth of wealth. An entire year's worth of wealth. So that means that let's bring it to today. The average median income in America is roughly $50,000. She just poured 50 grand on Jesus' head. All right? Now, it's really funny when we have moments like this, because we're just like the disciples. We have moments like this. Do you think the disciples were really concerned about the poor? We get self-righteous. We come up with a way that we're against something by stating something that sounds religious, don't we? It's our way of putting it, to making it seem unselfish, to make it seem godly, to make it seem right, even though we know down inside what our real motive is, and we refuse to look at it. But here is what Jesus replies to this righteous, fake righteousness. All right? Here's what he says. Aware of this, Jesus said to them, "Why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me." Jesus asks a question at the heart level. It's her perfume and it's her money, guys. And if she decides she wants to sacrifice her perfume and her money to bless me, that's her business. And besides, her act is coming from her heart. And it was not the disciples, it's not you guys to set and judge how she feels or what she wants to do. And then Jesus really gets to them. He says this, the poor you will always have with you. The poor will always be there. And then Jesus deals with their seeming righteousness, their fake righteousness. He says this, but you will not always have me. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. Now remember their understanding of Messiah. They don't like this. They're looking at each other. They've got this puzzled look, a frustration look. Why? Because how can you attain priestly status if you die? How can you be the king of Israel if you die? How can you conquer Rome and everybody else if you are dead? So here's the real question that the disciples were asking. If you die, what is going to happen to us? Don't you just, I love the Bible. I love these stories because these are real people just like you and me. Because this is what we do. This is the moment, the event, the straw that broke the camel's back. Matthew records right here. Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" Now we can speculate what was going on in Judas's mind, but we can't know for certain. We can say he was done with the games that he felt Jesus was playing. In other words, man, every time I think you're going to do it right, then you do this, and I've just had it with you. Or it could be that he was frustrated because he's maybe thinking, dude, I have invested all of this time with you. I have been waiting for these moments, and you're just constant disappointment, and I've wasted like 2.5, 3 years of my life. Or it could be, all right, if you don't want to make the move, I'm going to force you to make the move. Because if you are really Messiah, and I really think you are, I'm going to put you between a rock and a hard place, and I'm going to force you to make the move that I know you need to make. Regardless of what he was thinking, Judas was going to place himself in a position to profit. Remember, there's a right way, a wrong way, and his way. Now, the two key words here are deliver him. Deliver him. Do you remember what had kept Caiaphas from arresting Jesus? The crowds, right? The crowds. So Judas is an insider. He has access to Jesus nearly 24/7, and he knew he could get Jesus away from the crowds. That would be worth something to Caiaphas, wouldn't it? So here's what the next line reads. So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. $15 pieces of silver. Half. 30 pieces. Now I want you to stop and think about something. Caiaphas had access to the entire temple treasury. They could have given much more. Judas was with Jesus, chosen by Jesus, and had seen Jesus heal, walk on the water, and raise the dead. He sold his relationship with Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. He was so fed up that he sold his relationship and sold a human life for 30 pieces of silver. Today, this coin is worth about $16.40. In his day, it would have been a much flatter coin, not as pure, and worth a lot less. And he sold Jesus for that. That's not much, is it? That's not much. Not much when you are starting, when you're staring at the temple treasury. Think about how you and I have been, though, tempted to sell out our relationship with Jesus for a lot less. At that moment, in possible anger, in frustration, with Jesus, this must have felt right for Judas. You see, when you're in it for you, you lose perspective. When you're in it for you, you lose perspective. Then Matthew writes this. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. Now, as the events unfold, what happens is they're in this last week, the week that we're in. Jesus says to some of his disciples, I want you to go find us a place to go so we can have Passover together. And they go in Jerusalem and they find a place for them to go. They get them a room. And when they arrive there, there's no slave to wash their feet. There's no one to do the traditional greeting. And so they're all looking around, trying to figure out the pecking order, because I'm Peter and I'm one of the big three, or I'm James, I'm John, I'm one of these. And they're going through the pecking order. Who's the low guy on the totem pole? Who's going to wash our feet? And before they can even move, here's what happens. Jesus has taken off his outer garment, wrapped a towel around his waist, got a basin of water, and kneeling down in front of them, he begins to wash their feet. And Peter will have none of this. Why? Because they didn't want a suffering servant. They didn't want a servant Messiah. They wanted a king. They wanted a priest. They wanted a warrior. And Jesus tells them, guys, this is what it's like. I'm your teacher. I'm the one. And if I do this, you do this. Because as a follower of mine, you too will have to walk this path of servanthood. And so it's during this time, after this, they're sitting around, they're having the Passover meal. And in the midst of the meal, John records this. Jesus says, very truly, I tell you, one of you is going to betray me. Now, Matthew, in his record, says they all began to look around and they began to ask this question, is it me? Is it me? But I'm wondering what Judas is thinking, because Judas knows what he's done. He's got 30 pieces of silver. And he knows that Jesus has healed. He knows Jesus has done all these things. And I'm just kind of sitting there wondering, oh man, Jesus has all this. He knows the gig is up. He knows. But does Jesus call him out? Jesus doesn't call him out. Jesus doesn't say, dude, what are you doing? He doesn't say, go change the deed. Go do something, but you're erring. Don't you know what you're doing? Jesus doesn't do that whatsoever. This is what Jesus does. He leans over and he says to him quietly, what you are about to do quickly. Now, the rest of the guys, they don't know what's up because, he's the treasurer. So here's what the record says. Since Judas had charge of the money, some thought Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the feast or to give something to the poor. So Judas leaves to betray Jesus, and Jesus doesn't stop him. Then Jesus says something really interesting. Now the Son of Man is glorified and God is glorified in him. Okay, here's what you got to hear. To be glorified means to bestow honor or praise and adoration. So what for? Because the plan of God for redemption of us is underway through Jesus. But are you ready? The plan of God for redemption for us is underway through Judas. Remember last week? Last week we said something. We demonstrated that in our lives, to resist God does something. When we resist God, it always demonstrates the futility of resisting God. Because here's the deal. God's plan cannot be stopped. God cannot be thwarted. Now, we don't know what Judas was thinking at this point. We don't know if he's thinking as he's going ahead thinking, okay, my plan's working. I'm going to get I got 30 pieces of silver to turn him over, so I'm playing the priests. All right, I'm playing them. At the same time, maybe he's thinking, and I'm going to put Jesus right where I need him to be to make the move, so I'm coming out a winner on both sides here. So he must be thinking everything's okay. And he told the priests and all of those guys, he said, the one that I kiss, that's Jesus. So he comes to the Garden of Gethsemane. Why does he go there? Because he knows that's where Jesus is going to pray. He also knows that there's only going to be 11 with him. And there's only going to be 3 relatively close to him. So he's away from the crowds. This is his moment. This is his opportunity. Here comes all the tiki torches down the path, all right? And they're coming to Jesus, and he comes right up to him, and he greets him with a kiss. And they arrest him. And they take him, and they try him. And they brutally beat him. And the next thing you know, here's what he hears. They've given him and taken him to the Romans. And that only means one thing. Because the Romans are the only ones who can kill him. And now Judas is going, uh-oh. And here's what the word said. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. Now listen closely. I'm wrapping up. What had extraordinary value? What had extraordinary value 1 minute had no value the next minute. What was worth selling Jesus for 1 minute was the focus of regret the next minute. What he sacrificed his relationship with Jesus for was something he wished he'd never done at all. Your greatest regret and my greatest regret in life are always based on our attempts to prop up something, or to hang on to something, or to hang on to someone that's not a part of our life anymore. We look back and say, why did I do that? Why was I with that person? Why did I do those things with that person? Or why did I go do this? Or why did I go do that? I wish if I could go back, I wouldn't do that. I'd do something different. It's our greatest regret. And our greatest regret with God is always trying to make a deal with God, trying to barter with God, trying to get God to do what we want him to do. And Matthew states the words that are so horrific. This is what he says. He says this, quoting Judas, I have sinned, he said, for I have betrayed innocent blood. And then, as he's saying this to the priests, as he's taken his 30 pieces of silver back, trying to give it back, trying to change the outcome. And he says, I have sinned, and he says, I have betrayed innocent blood. And here's what the priests say. Listen to this. What is that to us? That's your responsibility. That's your responsibility. And then Matthew records, so Judas threw the money into the temple because it had no value. Then he went and hanged himself. This is why it's a big deal. Too many reject Jesus to preserve something they'll lose in the end anyway. And when we barter rather than surrender, we are responsible for the outcome. Now, this should frighten us. Because here's the thing I want you to understand about God. God will not interfere. God will not interfere with your freedom and your will. He will not come in and say, you're going to lose more than you'll ever gain. This is going to be disastrous for your life. He's going to say, if that's what you're determined to do, if that's where you're going to sell me out, if that's what you're going to, then I'm not going to stop you. You know better. It's your responsibility. In fact, it's interesting that there's a couple of different interpretations of the word wrath. One is the lightning bolt from heaven and the earth shakes wrath. And the other is sin has consequences. Just like God doesn't send people to hell. God's a gentleman. If you don't want anything to do with him and you don't want him in your life and you want him to be out of your life, he's a gentleman. He will send you to a place where he won't be. So you choose where you go. And so he's not going to interfere, even if he knows that it's bad for you, even if his heart is breaking, even if his heart is wrenching over this, he's not going to force himself onto you. And so here's what we have in common with Judas. We barter. But what we barter with begins immediately to lose value. The reason we barter is that we feel bartering is easier than surrendering. And here's the lesson. When we surrender, God takes responsibility for the outcome of the journey. When we don't, we take responsibility for the outcome of the journey. So this means that the safest, most purposeful place that you and I can be is dead center in the will of God. It may not always be happy. It may not always be great. It may have its trials and tribulations, but there is no greater place to be than right there. There's no safer place to be than right there. Even if it takes your life, when you are in the dead center of God's will, your life does not cease. It may feel riskier to surrender, but what is riskier? God's will or 30 pieces of silver? Father, in Jesus' name, we come and ask that you would help us to surrender rather than to barter. We can ask in the name of Jesus, and there are times which you say yes, and you bless us with what we hope for and long for, and then some. But there are times when we come to you and we ask in your name, surrendering you, and say, oh Lord, could you? And sometimes out of your wisdom you say no. And it's hard for us to receive and accept, because sometimes there's things in life, there are people in life, there's circumstances in life that we so desperately want to cling to and hold on to, that we're so passionate about, that we care so deeply about. And yet, there are those things that you know better about. So, Lord, help us to risk surrendering rather than the riskier 30 pieces of silver. Because we've all bartered, just like Judas, and it never works out. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.